Hi Year 12, welcome to this lecture looking at the new right view on the role of the education system. Sorry the formatting's gone a bit odd on this slide. When we think about the new right, it's worth just thinking about where they fit into the structure of the other theoretical perspectives, and I know we have touched on this in class. The new right is generally considered the more conservative, if you like, the much more traditional branch of functionalism. Now, many of their policies have been very heavily, the New Right perspective has been very heavily influenced by Margaret Thatcher and her government during the she was voted in 1979 and she stayed in power all the way through most of the 1980s as well. Here's a very famous quote from Margaret Thatcher, actually made to Women's Own magazine, surprisingly. "I have a problem, I'll get a grant. I'm homeless, the government must house me. They are casting their problems on society. And you know, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." So, what do you think Thatcher meant by this quote? What's she really, really trying to attack here? Margaret Thatcher was most famous for being an ardent fan of what we call neoliberal capitalism. And she trusted the principles of this sort of neoliberal capitalist economy more possibly than her own government to possibly operate some of the social services and welfare state effectively. Neoliberal basically means new liberal, and liberal capitalism is free trade, free capitalism. It's the idea that you allow the market to sort out the strongest from the weakest, and the strongest companies and the strongest companies that make the most profit, they survive, and the weakest companies who can't trade effectively and can't create the right products that attract people, they effectively go bankrupt and they kind of disappear from the economy. And she believed that things worked best and more efficiently when they behaved like they were a company in a business marketplace. So as a result, the welfare state had to go, because one of the main principles of a company in a business marketplace is you do things for profitability, whereas the welfare state has got nothing to do with profit. It's about providing services, and they're financed by the government. So can you think of any examples, or can you research an example of a Margaret Thatcher policy that actually got rid of an element of the welfare state? Now, I can give you one example, but I'd like you to try and find another example of where Margaret Thatcher tried to roll back the welfare state and replace it with private companies, if you like. So the one that I always think about is when she nationalised the rail service. So that National Rail used to be run by the government. Rail fares were, if you like, subsidised to an extent by the government, and she sold them to private companies. So now when we buy our train tickets, we don't buy them from National Rail, we buy them from Virgin, we buy them from East Midland Rail. So these are all private companies. And the idea is these companies are apparently better because they compete with each other for our custom. So see if you can think of any other examples where she's rolled back the welfare state and instead replaced it with some sort of private company, which would force everything to act more efficiently in her view. So when we look at the new right and the impact that theory's had on education, it's been huge, to be honest with you. It's probably had the most significant impact on an educational policy than any of the other theoretical perspectives, largely because they're so closely associated with the Conservative Party. So the new right are very critical of too much control by the state in education, and they see it as inefficient. So their solution to what was happening in education was to kind of instill market values in the education system by creating competition between schools. So if you can get schools to compete with each other, then in theory they should try and raise their standards to attract more business. Now, you might be thinking, well, what are they competing for? Well, effectively, they're going to compete for parents. They're going to try and get the parents in their local area to send their kids to their schools. So it gives parents greater choice. So parents could pick any school to send their child to. They could go to the open evenings and what have you, and they could find out which school they felt was best. And schools have to now try very, very hard to attract these customers, if you like. Now, previously, schools had been giving a set budget every year, year on year, no matter what. And actually it was the local authorities that managed that budget. So our local authority is East Sussex County Council. So one of the things the New Right wanted schools to do, or the Thatcher government I suppose, was to be more financially independent, in the sense that they couldn't spend the money however they wanted. They had to be mindful of budgets, they had to try and save money for big projects, and they couldn't rely on a fixed amount of money coming from the government every single year. So financial control, if you like, was devolved down into schools, and now schools now have finance officers that manage the money within the schools, as opposed to having it managed at county level. However, it didn't stop there. New Right wanted schools to, like I said, compete for parents. They wanted parents to send their kids to their schools. And this was all to do with how the funding of schools was changed under these policy reforms. Like I said, beforehand schools were given a budget every year, no matter what. Now they shifted to a policy that I always call bums on seats, but the official definition is the funding formula, where every single student is now worth a certain amount of money to every school. So the more students you get coming to your school, the more money you get. And the less students you get coming to your school, the less money you get. So you can understand how this created what's called like an education marketplace, where schools would compete for customers in the form of parents sending their kids to their schools. The more kids they got, the more money every school got to spend on, I don't know, books, staff, buildings, services, you name it. So, can you think of any examples of recent educational policies that perhaps illustrate this view that schools need to be more financially independent, or that schools need to be in competition with each other a bit more? So can you think of any recent educational policies that kind of create more competition, give parents more choice, and make schools run a bit more like businesses? And in class, we're going to be looking at the New Right view of education, so that's something we'll be doing together. To help with that question, if you Google Education Policy Guardian, it'll take you to the Guardian website and it'll show you all the recent educational policies. So see if you can see any evidence of marketisation in schools. Things like tuition fees are a good example, in the sense that now universities have to compete for students because they now pay them £9,000 a year. But also that's evidence of neoliberalism as well, Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism, because the state no longer pays for you to go to university, you've got to pay for yourself to go to university. So, you know, it rolls back the welfare state that Margaret Thatcher really, really didn't like. The main New Right sociologists you guys need to remember are Chubb and Moe. Now, Chubb and Moe, they did some research in the United States of America, and they found that the state education system over there, so the one paid for by the government, had failed to provide equality of opportunity or the skills needed by the economy. Now, that's really important if you remember, because the New Right hate the welfare state. They like everyone to get jobs when they leave school, so they don't like it if people are leaving school without the right skills needed by businesses in the economy. They found that private schools provided a better service because they are answerable to their customers, aka the parents. So obviously, if you go to a private school, your parents will pay thousands of pounds every term. And what Chubb and Moe found was these private schools had to keep on delivering good results for these kids. Otherwise, parents would quite simply say, right, we're not sending our child to you anymore because you're not giving us the results we're paying for. So they'd take their child to a different private school. As part of their research, they found that children from low-income families that went to private schools actually achieved 5% more than those in state schools. I can only imagine that those children from low-income families were possibly at the private schools because of scholarships possibly being awarded to them where they wouldn't have had to pay the fees in the first place. It's worth thinking at this point that's something we can maybe criticise about Chubb and Moe's research, because those working class students, if you like, could have won those scholarships, probably would have been quite gifted anyway. However, let's look up at the rest of their research. So Chubb and Moe recommended that we needed to create an education marketplace, that we need to develop market forces in schools and create a sense of supply and demand in order to create more competition between schools. So let's have a quick look at what that's actually looked like in the education system more recently. So how do market forces actually work in practice? Well, the government introduced parental choice, which I spoke to you about before, where parents can choose whatever school their child go to, as long as they can get them there. So they got rid of things like catchment areas and what have you. And as I mentioned before, the more parents that choose a school for their child, the more money that school gets. In order to help this parental choice, the government also introduced Ofsted, which is like this external inspection that all schools are subject to every 3 to 4 years. And these reports, these inspection reports, are published. I'm sure you're aware they sort of grade schools from outstanding right down to inadequate, I think is the lowest one. They also introduced league tables, which are published every year, of exam results, and these are all, at our level, they're sort of GCSE exam results. We have A-level exam result league tables, and what this allows parents to quite easily do in local areas is to look at, oh, that school's doing really brilliantly with their exam results, that must be a really good school to go to. So again, it means schools have to compete against each other to get the best league table position, and in order to do that, they need to get their students in their schools to do well in their exams. So in theory, this benefits the students because schools must have to try much harder to get all students to get good exam results. All of this does is gives parents lots more information to make informed choices between schools. Now, can you think of any other ways in which market forces, which is like competition and choice, work within the education system, apart from league tables and Ofsted inspection reports? So do you see any other evidence of schools behaving like businesses? Is there anything else that he feels maybe done recently around the school that makes you think, oh, hang on, they're trying to sell Heathfield to parents? See if you can spot any evidence from around the school of how we try and market ourselves and make us more attractive to prospective parents or students, like, sixth form students as well, because you're all worth money as well. As well as kind of those sorts of systems, the state also introduced something called the national curriculum, which you're very familiar with, and the teaching of citizenship. Now, this is very important because basically there's no way that we can rank schools and therefore students in terms of how well they're doing in terms of exams unless they're all studying the same thing, hence the national curriculum. This also fed into the economy and the economy's needs. So the government was able to tell us from a very top-down approach that actually the national curriculum needed to be geared towards particular subjects because that's what industry needed. And they also introduced citizenship, which is arguably the principle of making sure we're all ending up with the same or very similar norms and values. So you can think about your citizenship teaching. You think of how it tried to make sure that you all ended up with the same sort of value consensus. Because don't forget, New Right, like I said, traditional version of functionalism. One of the fundamental roles of education is to socialise us into being socially acceptable human beings. So before we end this lecture, can we have a consideration about how the marketisation of education, which is all this is, what are the problems with introducing market forces into the education system? I'll give you an example of one evaluation point and see if you can think of any other ones. So one of the problems that I'm aware of with the parental choice element is, great, you can send your student to any school in the area that you want to, but some parents can afford to take their children to schools that are a bit further away. So some parents, because they've got access to their own transport or they can afford the buses or the trains, might be able to send their kid, to a good school that's a bit out of area, whereas working class parents don't have that option and they might have to use the local school, which actually means they don't really get the parental choice. They actually have their choices limited purely because of transport costs. So that's one criticism of this approach. Can you think of any other weaknesses of the New Right approach to reforming education? And we'll talk about that in class. Thanks very much, Year 12. Bye.